The collapse of a dynasty is usually imagined as a moment when force finally meets resistance. A door is breached, a banner is torn down, the crowd appears, and power is pushed aside by volume. But in Petrograd in early 1917, the most striking feature was how little power had to be pushed. The regime did not fall under a blow. It receded while still standing. Authority remained visible, named, titled, officially intact, even as its capacity to compel action quietly dissolved. The contradiction is unsettling. An empire that still existed, issuing orders, appointing officials, commanding armies, yet unable to provoke either loyalty or rebellion in its own defense. Power was present, but it no longer summoned response. For more than 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty had governed through a dense architecture of obedience. Authority flowed downward through ministries, provincial governors, police structures, military commands, and ritual affirmation. The Tsar's position was not contingent on popularity or negotiation. It was fixed by lineage and reinforced by ceremony, law derived from his person. Administration existed to transmit his will. The empire's vastness made this arrangement seem necessary, even natural. Distance required hierarchy. Complexity required delegation. But beneath this structure lay an assumption rarely tested directly, that obedience would continue without renewal, that legitimacy, once established, did not require recalibration. By the early 20th century, the formal apparatus remained formidable. The state collected taxes, mobilized soldiers, regulated industry, censored speech. Nicholas II retained absolute authority in law. The court functioned. The Duma existed but did not govern. The police monitored cities and villages. Russia entered the First World War not as a collapsing state, but as a recognized great power. Nothing in the institutional surface suggested imminent disappearance. And yet the daily act of rule had begun to slip from certainty into routine. Commands were issued because they had always been issued. Compliance was expected because it had always followed. The pressure that exposed this fragility did not arrive as a single challenge. It accumulated across domains that authority treated as separate. Military strain did not immediately translate into political crisis. Food shortages were managed as logistical problems. Labor unrest was classified as disorder. Each issue was addressed within its assigned channel, preserving the illusion of control. What went unnoticed was the convergence. As conditions worsened, decisions required coordination rather than repetition. Authority, long practiced in issuing directives, now faced situations that demanded judgment under uncertainty. It responded by leaning harder on form. The war intensified this mismatch. Mobilization expanded the state's reach while stretching its coherence. Orders multiplied faster than they could be enforced. Responsibility blurred as failures cascaded upward without resolution. At the top, the Tsar remained the final authority, but authority delayed is authority deferred. His absence from the capital during critical periods was not unprecedented, yet it mattered differently now. Power that governs through symbolic presence depends on proximity at moments of ambiguity. Distance turned hesitation into paralysis. In Petrograd, the signs were not immediately political. Bread lines lengthened. Transportation faltered. Factories closed intermittently. These were disruptions, not declarations. The state observed them through reports that framed them as temporary or local. Language preserved continuity. The regime still spoke as if its voice defined reality. But beneath the language, the reflex to comply weakened. Soldiers questioned orders without refusing them. Officials delayed implementation while awaiting clarification that did not arrive. Clerks followed procedures precisely even when those procedures no longer matched circumstances. The system did not break, it slowed. When crowds gathered, they did not assemble as an opposition movement. They assembled as people responding to absence. Absence of food, absence of heat, absence of reassurance. Authority interpreted these gatherings through inherited categories of unrest. The response was calibrated for dissent, not erosion. Commands to suppress demonstrations moved through a chain that assumed willingness at every link. Instead, each link hesitated, not out of ideology, but out of uncertainty about consequence. To act decisively required confidence that authority still stood behind action. That confidence was no longer automatic. This hesitation was contagious. Once one unit delayed, delay became precedent. Once enforcement required deliberation, deliberation replaced reflex. Power that had relied on momentum found itself forced to generate justification. Yet justification was not part of its vocabulary. The Romanov regime had governed by assertion, not persuasion. When assertion met uncertainty, it repeated itself louder, issuing proclamations that reaffirmed order without restoring it. Ritual intensified as efficacy declined. The absence of an immediate revolt is often misread as stability. In reality, it signaled something more corrosive. Revolt implies an object to oppose, a force to confront. What the Romanov state presented in February 1917 was not a coherent force, but a hollowed center. Authority remained symbolically intact, but its presence no longer organized behavior. The crowd did not storm the Winter Palace because there was no urgency to do so. Power was already dispersing, slipping into committees, councils, ad hoc arrangements that did not yet claim sovereignty, but began to exercise it. Inside the regime, this diffusion was difficult to recognize. Officials continued to act as if the center would reassert itself. Ministers issued statements that assumed obedience would resume once disturbances passed. Generals waited for clearer directives rather than improvising. The Tsar, informed of events through fragmented reports, responded by reaffirming hierarchy. Each response arrived late, not because of incompetence alone, but because the structure itself delayed adaptation. Authority that rests on continuity struggles to move quickly without undermining its own logic. When abdication finally occurred, it did not feel like a rupture equal to the scale of the empire it ended. It felt procedural. A document signed, authority transferred, titles adjusted. The act acknowledged a reality that had already unfolded. The regime had not been overthrown so much as left behind. Its collapse was administrative rather than dramatic, confirming that power had thinned before it fell. The unsettling aspect of this pattern lies in its invisibility from within. Power listens for challenge. It watches for confrontation, for organized opposition, for language that denies its legitimacy. What it struggles to perceive is indifference, delay, conditional compliance. The Romanov regime faced complaints and shortages, but interpreted them through frameworks that assumed eventual normalization. Silence in this context was misread as patience. Hesitation was misread as loyalty waiting for instruction. By the time refusal appeared, authority was already dispersed. This raises a quieter question about power's self-awareness. Can authority recognize erosion before it manifests as opposition? Or does its very structure filter perception in ways that delay recognition until restoration is no longer possible? The Romanovs governed a system that rewarded continuity and punished deviation. Initiative carried risk. In uncertainty, waiting felt safer than acting. This logic preserved order under stable conditions, but under compression, it produced paralysis. The days following abdication were marked by continuity rather than chaos. Offices reopened, trams ran, paperwork continued. This calm concealed the depth of transformation. Power had not vanished, it had relocated. It existed now in provisional forms, hesitant and contested, but active. The old regime's symbols lingered without force behind them. Authority, once concentrated, had become ambient, waiting to be claimed. The fall without revolt suggests that power may depend less on loyalty than on unexamined habit. When habit dissolves, Authority must either reconstitute itself deliberately or accept diffusion. The Romanov state attempted neither. It trusted the weight of history to carry obedience forward, unaware that history had already shifted its momentum. The pattern does not announce itself with violence. It announces itself with delay, with orders that arrive but do not move, with institutions that exist but no longer compel. The Romanovs did not hear the moment power went quiet because silence had always surrounded them. By the time that silence meant something different, the center could no longer speak into it. Subscribe to Timeless Questions for more thoughtful journeys into the ideas and forces that shape civilizations and continue to shape us.